Being safe for your marriage and being safe for your spouse requires the need to address anger. If there's one common denominator in dealing with infidelity that therapists will tell you they experience, and survivors of infidelity will tell you they experienced or dealt with in their spouse, it's anger. Now, everybody struggles with anger differently, and some spouses are going to rage and some spouses are going to be very passive aggressive. It's not necessarily the anger itself that causes a breakdown in the recovery process. It's how that anger is expressed. It's how that anger is managed or not managed. Because if you don't know how to deal with anger, I promise you, you will not be safe for the recovery process. You will not be safe for your spouse. And it is absolutely possible for you as a betrayed spouse to not be safe for the recovery process because you haven't been able to, and I know this is tough to hear, but if you haven't been able to understand how to manage and deal with your anger or your rage, while it is completely understandable that you would be so angry because of the hurt and the devastation that you are having to deal with and will have to deal with for quite some time, we still have to help you manage that anger, or else it will completely undermine the entire process. The number one kind of comeback I hear is, are you saying that anger is wrong? Are you expecting me as a betrayed spouse to not be angry? Well, what about the unfaithful spouse? What if I'm angry because my spouse didn't do what they needed to do, and so I can be angry about my marriage and the status of my marriage? I'm not judging your anger, but I do want to help you understand that while anger is very common, if you don't deal with it the right way, continuing to attack your spouse, continuing to attack your unfaithful spouse or your betrayed spouse is only going to perpetuate the cycle that has probably gotten you where you're at. And if you don't address that anger, it's going to destroy you both and any hopes of restoration, not because of the infidelity, but because of the inability to manage the anger. I'd like to make just a few observations about anger, some of them from unfaithful, some from betrayed, or some just general observations. But when anger is unmanaged, you really can't connect. It throws up a giant wall that prevents you from connecting with your spouse. It doesn't allow you to be able to get on the same page and feel like you're gaining any momentum because anger is thrown up as a defense mechanism, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the anger prevents you both from being able to connect at a vulnerable level or an intimate level, which then will create a complete and utter stall for any meaningful recovery. A second way that I think anger completely undermines recovery is that who wants to be vulnerable, whether you're betrayed or you're unfaithful, with someone who's just going to revert to anger every time they are triggered? And that isn't a statement at the betrayed, because the unfaithful can be triggered as well. What I mean is when anger is unmanaged, neither spouse wants to open up their heart and share their deepest fears, deepest struggles, deepest worries, deepest violations, deepest unmet needs, because as long as the anger is unmanaged, that private part of vulnerability is stuffed down, which then, and that leads me to another way that anger upsets the process, is that leads to resentment. And when you are constantly reverting back to anger, it only breeds more and more resentment. It only breeds more and more bitterness. And as you probably have experienced, regardless of how long you've been in this recovery journey, when bitterness and resentment are operating, it prevents you from even wanting to participate in recovery. You throw your hands up and say, there's no hope. I don't even want to talk to you without our therapist there. I don't even want to communicate with you without a third party because I don't feel safe. Incidentally, there were several times in the recovery process where Samantha did not want to talk to me without Rick Reynolds there. It made me so angry. Early on, I would push and say, And I would do everything, right? I mean, I wanted to be an attorney, and I studied debate, and I used to debate people all the time, and so I would do every trick I could to try and get Samantha to talk with me because I wanted to shred her argument, prove to her that she was wrong, shred her allegation that she was making about me and my lack of character or this or that, and completely turn it so that I would be able to make her the problem and not me. So when she drew a line in the sand and said, I can't talk with you about anything deep without Rick there because I know what you're going to try and do, I would lose it. And so I had to learn that that was my own unmanaged anger, but it was also bitterness and resentment towards Samantha. And I had a whole lot of stuff to work on, so that was one of the best things for us during a certain season, because I know some of you may be tempted to say, well, you're angry, so we can't talk. That's not what I'm saying. When a spouse doesn't feel safe because of past abuses or anger that has been abusive or bullying tactics, which I was the king of, there's something wrong and the anger has to be addressed. A third way, and perhaps probably the most telling way that anger will undermine the process for me and Samantha, if you will, is we would trigger each other. She would get angry, and then I would get angry. And she would ultimately say, well, why are you angry? But anger was the way that I would push away my guilt and shame. And we as unfaithful spouses, or sometimes even betrayed spouses, we will use anger to push down or push away our guilt or push away our shame. And so our go-to, if you will, our go-to tool is anger. And so Samantha would get angry, then I would get angry, and we would go back and forth, triggering, spiraling, and we got caught in a cycle where some people even get addicted to anger as a defense mechanism. And again, I want to tell you, anger is part of the process. It's not that you can't be angry, or it's not that you don't have any reason to be angry. But that anger has to be expressed within the confines and within the boundaries of love, because if not, then it's going to become destructive and it's going to undermine the process, and you won't be safe because every time you talk, you get angry, and then your spouse shuts down and maybe gives you the silent treatment or gives you their own passive-aggressive anger, and you guys get stuck. So Samuel, what do? Yes, we have anger. Yes, we're spiraling, and our anger is at some level unmanageable. Here's a few things that you can do. Number one, you have to understand that anger is part of the process, but you have to be able to speak the truth in love. You have to be able to keep your anger expressed within the confines of love and both respect for your spouse as well as your own self-respect. I've talked to so many people who lost their mind and anger got out of control, and man, they lost their own self-respect because of how they handled themselves. Number two, I would tell you that you really want to do some reading or some studying or consult a professional to deal with your anger. Some of you may need to consider going through some anger management work. Some of you just may need to identify the roots of your anger. Okay, you're angry, but what is really going on at the root? Is it violation? Is it self-hatred? Is it unmet needs? Is it bitterness and resentment? Because if you can identify the roots of your anger, you can begin to establish a protocol to address those roots. Again, you're going to need help to deal with this anger because it's not just going to go away with time. Time doesn't heal all wounds. It's what you do with the time. And this is going to be tough to hear. It's very common for an unfaithful spouse to be angry when they are the one that's cheated. It's probably because they're pushing away their guilt and shame. It may be their go-to tool. It may be that they're dealing with their own self-hatred. It may be that they have resentment towards you because they feel like they cheated for realistic and good reasons because you weren't doing what you should have done in the marriage. It's also easy for the betrayed spouse to be incredibly angry because look what the unfaithful spouse has done to them. It's understandable. For many, they would say, well, You shouldn't have cheated. So you're going to have to deal with my anger. And I would appeal to you that there's an element of truth in that, but that is not the totality of truth, because while they did cheat, that doesn't justify torture. There's a difference between managed anger through the expression of love, which is the best interest of another, and then there's just torture, and no amount of torturing your mate is going to make the pain go away that you're feeling or is going to make them get it quicker. It just doesn't work that way. I promise you, if you can deal with the anger, you can make the process safe for both of you. And as you've heard so many times already, if the process can be safe, and if you can be safe for your spouse, you will minimize the time it takes to heal. You will gain ground so much faster than you can believe, because you have become a safe person and you've made the process safe.